Do we raise our dogs the way our parents raised us? Welcome to Is This Legit? Research Reality Check with me, Dr. Kirsten Lee Hill. Let's dig into this viral claim. There was a video from a company called Kinship that I caught. It's like a pet parenting website that gives resources, gives advice. I think maybe they try to sell you on some services as well. It's cute. It's cute. But the study just like really caught my eye because they made this viral video. They had a little like article that came out with it. And it's like new study shows. And whenever it's a new study showing something, like I'm invested. I want to know what's going on, right? So it was the new study shows that we raise our dogs the same way our parents raised us. And as a proud childless dog lady, I had to press pause and be like, really? Do we? Do I raise Ken how I was raised? Because I'm going to be honest, just no. Like immediately no. I do not raise Ken how I was raised. I am like a helicopter dog mom for starters, not saying that that's the right way to be, just saying I'm a helicopter dog mom. I am constantly watching him, making sure his every need is met. He is babied. Like it's a very different style of parenting than I received growing up. And like, no, no offense, mom and dad. It's just very, very different. Ken is like very accustomed to like gentle guidance, a sing-songy voice, who make up songs about like literally everything, and just like positive reinforcement, like always reward, never punish. And like the house I grew up in, like there was yelling and the threat of spanking. That's just like very different. So I hear something like, hey, we are raising our dogs how we were raised. And I'm like, are we? Like, I'm not. Am I the outlier? Am I the one person reading this who, like, this isn't true for? Or is this actually just a clickbaity headline that's based on fake research or research that's been misinterpreted? And it was a little funny because it's almost like Kinship anticipated that people might be a little skeptical of this because they put something in their actual article that said, if you read that and thought, hey, I don't parent my dog anything like how I was parented, that's valid. This study is simply saying that we tend to be informed by what we know. But is the study simply saying that? Even that interpretation is a stretch. So, like, what is really going on here? Dog parents. Are we really raising our pups the same way our parents raised us? Is our parenting style being informed by how we were raised? Or are we just looking at some like good old fashioned misreading of science? Let's break it down. As always, when I see a clickworthy claim, I want to go like straight to the source. I want to see like the actual research that was published that said this. And in this case, I found the research in a journal called Animals in an article that was published in 2024. And the name of the article is Intergenerational Transmission of Human Parenting Styles to Human Dog Relationships. Kind of a mouthful. I will put the link in the description to this episode so that you can look at it and dig into it on your own at your leisure. So here is what researchers found in their own words. This is a direct quote. This study found that a permissive parenting style tends to be passed down across generations, with individuals who experienced it growing up being more likely to use it with their dogs. If your eyebrows are not raised suspiciously yet, they should be. Because, like, let's go back to what I just said. Permissive parenting styles tend to be passed down. Not all parenting styles, not multiple parenting styles, even permissive parenting styles. So, right off the bat, like immediately, we can see that Kinship's claim, which is implying that we're all parenting our dogs how we were parented, is vastly oversimplifying and actually misrepresenting what the research actually concluded. So, like, we could stop there and just be like, you know what? It's not true. They misinterpreted it. They should have had a headline that said permissive parenting styles, but That would have been more confusing and like not really good clickbait. So, like, okay, end of story. But we're not going to stop there because this is good practice and there is much more we can unpack about this study. So, let's dive a little bit deeper using the same framework that we used last week, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. Just my favorite tool for cutting through the BS and getting to the truth. So let's start with the why. What was the motivation behind this study? The researchers explained in their paper that parenting styles and how they're passed down across generations is something that's pretty well studied in human families. And they also note that dogs have, over the past few years, become increasingly like cherished, beloved members of our family. Like they use the word fur babies, like many of us do. Like they are our fur babies. As dogs are recognized as an increasingly important part of our family unit, the researchers were interested in understanding if, like, hey, like if humans parent their children is similar to how they are parented, is how humans parent their fur babies also similar to how they were parented? And they thought that, if we understand these dynamics of like the relationship between a human and a dog better, can we use that insight to improve dog well being and improve our relationships with dogs, which is a great purpose, right? So, purpose of the study: gain more insight into the relationship between human and dogs and how it may or may not relate to the relationship we have with our parents in terms of how we were raised. Important context we have here is that there is a focus on 4 parenting styles. So there is authoritative parenting. That is when you have what they call high demands, high responsiveness. So that's like your parents, they tell you what to expect. You have like clear rules and guidelines, but they also are giving you like the sensitivity, like support. They're considering your needs and feelings, right? So like they may expect a lot, but they're also giving you a lot of like support and love and like just being responsive to your needs. Then there is authoritarian parenting, and that is when you have high demands and low responsiveness. This is more like a household that is like strict and not sensitive. So, like, you might have your own individual needs and like you got to follow the rules. Like, the rules are what matter here. Then we have permissive parenting, and permissive parenting is low demands but high responsiveness. So, this is like parents are really recognizing your needs, they're being more sensitive to the needs and your feelings, but they aren't able to provide like more direction and structure. Not necessarily they're not able to, like, they don't provide more rules or structures such as those that you would find in an authoritative or an authoritarian household. And then lastly, you just have like uninvolved. And this is kind of self explanatory, but it's like lowest effort parenting. They are phoning it in. They don't really have demands. They're also not really sensitive to your needs, like kind of MIA. So we have 4 parenting types, and I kind of think about them as like you have like a more like warm but still structured, and like that's the authoritative. And then there's strict, which is authoritarian. And then there's like a supportive free for all, which is permissive. And then there's MIA, like the uninvolved parenting style. Using this framework, I would say that with Ken, I am like permissive, trying to be more authoritative, right? Like it's kind of like a loving, supportive free for all, but I really am working hard. I have a trainer and everything to like put more rules and structures in place. Whereas I think I was raised in an environment that was much more like authoritarian, maybe a little closer to authoritative. Like it was, depending on which parent you got, more strict and less sensitive. But 2 parents, each one parented a little differently. So like a mix of authoritative and authoritarian, but not permissive for sure. So, when did this data collection take place? This is actually like a nice, fun treat for us because the data collection happened in 2023. So, like, this is fresh data. And, like, that's delightful because it's up to date, right? And I also, at the same time, as much as I love that this is like fresh data, and I'm like, ooh, 2023, it was so recent. Part of me, the researcher part of me is also thinking like, wow, this would be like really rich, really cool data to have longitudinally, like over time, right? For people who were raised in different generations and have this data going back more years, and does it change over time? Like, would be super interesting. This study is a snapshot of 2023, and like that's great. It's fresh, but longitudinal could be really cool here too. Who and where? This study was actually open to people around the world, so like global reach, and it ended up including 391 people who had a dog. They called them dog caregivers. And they recruited these people through various social media platforms, and they specifically say Facebook and Instagram. I personally would love more details here, like they said they use Facebook groups, what kind of groups, what was the criteria, how are you finding people on Instagram? Like, just knowing that it was through social media does not satisfy my curiosity here. I think, like, again, how many groups, how they were picked is really important context, but that information isn't shared. And because your sample, like the people that you're collecting the data on, so heavily influences how we can interpret your findings, what you learned, this to me is actually like a major question mark, a red flag information that I'm like, ugh, like, did you seriously not make it public? Like, how you actually found these 391 people for your study? Like, what? Like, that was just like, how can I possibly interpret your results without knowing that? So, like, I'm a little suspect. I'm a little suspect about where these 391 people came from. Like, they came from the internet. Great. Like, I'm personally not using that method to recruit people. I want it to be like very structured and have a really clear process of like, and this is how I found people, and this is the criteria I used to pick a platform, and here's how I found the groups, to make sure with that lens of like getting a diverse sample, having people have like equal opportunity to participate. These are things you have to think through, and like that you would need to like plan. And this isn't saying they didn't plan it. They might have planned this all out very well and in a way that really put a lot of thought into the types of people they might attract into their study. But if they did, they didn't share it in their paper. So the world may never know. Eligibility criteria, so that's like who is able to actually participate in the data collection, because sometimes you like recruit for a study and like let's say 100 people say they're interested, but only 80 really match what you're looking for because you have specific eligibility criteria of people who you want the data from. They had the criteria of you had to be 18 or above, you had to have no diagnosis of mental illness, so like I would not be in the study, and you had to be currently caring for at least one dog. And it didn't matter if you had like just gotten the dog yesterday or if you had had the dog for like many years. They interviewed 10 of these 391 people, and the people for the interviews were randomly selected from people who said they were interested in being interviewed. That basically means like everyone who, this isn't how they did it, maybe it is, I don't know, but randomly selected, basically the metaphor we use is that all the people who are like, hey, I would do an interview about this, like all their names went into the hat, and the researchers like picked 10 names out of the hat, and that was how they get their sample. And people do random selection because they believe that it gives you a more representative look at all 391 people. So by randomly selecting those 10 people, the idea is that it's more likely to pick 10 people that represent the beliefs of the 391 people that were in the study. Let's dive in a little bit deeper to like, who are these 391 people who are participating? First off, it is almost exclusively females who are participating. When I say almost all, I mean 96.2%. That is a heavily female population. Important context, right? Because even the results that the researchers talk about are saying like people, humans, but really the data is almost exclusively on people who identify as females. So important note, important context. They're also all educated. I don't necessarily want to say like highly educated. I'll give you the facts and you can decide what term you would like to use yourself. But at least 70% of the people in the study had an undergraduate degree or above. 35.3% had a graduate degree, 7.7 had a PhD, And like based on the data table that they provided, there wasn't even like a survey option for people who had like less than a high school diploma. So looking at that, I'm like, this is like a pretty like well educated in the most traditional sense of the way sample. Is that amount of education representative of all dog owners, of most dog owners? Might we think that how you parent could vary by education level? Maybe, right? Again, just like some food for thought, some things to consider. In terms of age of people in the study, they had a pretty good mix. It's mostly adults ages 25 and older, but for like all of the groups they had above 25, they weren't exactly the same percent in each bucket, but like pretty similar. So like I'd say a good mix of age. And in terms of geography, they had 26.3% of the people were from the US, 24% were from Britain, and then they had smaller groups from Asia, Europe, Canada, and Australia. So about half were from like the USA or Britain, and then some mix of some other countries. Again, is this like representative of the globe? No, but like interesting and like definitely have some mix in there in terms of geography. 34.5% had children in their home, and 65.2% did not. So, not an even split, but again, like a mix. It's not that everyone didn't have children and everyone did have children. In terms of people's experience caring for dogs, they had some variation here as well. 24.8% had family dogs before, 24.3%. This was like their first time being the main caregiver for a dog. And 38.1% said like they had some experience like owning a dog before, different than having a family dog, like being the primary caretaker. So to recap, we have almost exclusively people who identify as female, who have at least a college degree, who are self-selected from internet communities that I would like have to guess like suggest some interest in like dogs or dog parenting, but we don't know. That's a mystery. Like just this is all to say like this is not a representative sample, and this researchers don't say it is. So like the researchers are very transparent about who is included in the study, but it's just important to know that diversity matters, representation matters. And when you don't have that, it is a limitation of the study, similar to what we discussed last week, just in the sense of like, don't go run around and being like, all people, everyone. That's not true. That's not true. So, what? The data for this study was collected via an online survey and then semi-structured interviews. And semi-structured interviews are like you have the questions you want to ask, but you allow like it to evolve a little bit with the conversation versus being like basically versus it being like a survey that you read and you stick to the script. The survey had 104 questions on it. They had questions about demographics that asked age, gender, education level, nationality, and then also about your experience caring for children and for dogs. They included a 32 item parenting styles and dimensions questionnaire, the 32 PSDQ, and that asked questions about parenting styles and like how often you do different things, and you rated yourself from 1 never to 5 always. And they also had a 31 item dog directed parenting style questionnaire, right? So, like similar questions as the first questionnaire, which was asking how you were parented. But this time they're asking like how you parent your dog. And I love that they did this. They give like an example of like how the questions compare from the two surveys. So, for instance, on the parenting style, like how you were parenting style, they would ask, my parents provided me reasons why rules should be obeyed. And on the dog form, it would say, I think about why rules should be obeyed by my dog, right? So like they found equivalent, not perfectly equivalent, but they matched questions from the parenting questionnaire to the dog parenting questionnaire, which is great. Notably, none of the questions in the survey were mandatory, so you could skip whatever you wanted. And also, notably, they did not include uninvolved parenting as a measure. So the questions that they included on the parenting questionnaires were only about authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive parenting styles. Uninvolved was just like completely left out. This is important to note, right? Because if you had an uninvolved parent, how then are you answering these questions? We could nerd out on the survey design here. We won't, because that's not the point. But that entire parenting style was just like completely dropped from the measures without a clear explanation. Important context. For the interviews, they did 30 to 60-minute interviews. They had 20 open-ended questions, and they were asking people to describe their views on human-dog relationships, their experience of how they were parented as a child, and then again to reflect on like those same questions from now the perspective of like how you parent your dog. They also did like really interesting sets of questions about whether or not they perceive, like whether or not they think that how they were parented was passed on to how they parent their dog, like doing some reflection to like dig deeper into like why this may or may not be true there. And even saying like are like what types of factors are influencing this relationship, how you interact with your dog. So super interesting, a lot of like rich data here. This is a great example of why interviews are such a good companion to surveys, because they really let you like dig deep and get at like the why. Like surveys are so good at getting at what, and a little bit more limited in like getting into the richness of like why something might be happening. So amazing use of like a more mixed methods approach here. So when they built out the model to see if how you were parented affected how you parent your dog, they included how you were parented and all of your demographics, and those variables predicted the outcome of how you parent your dog. They mentioned doing some stratified analyses, so like looking at subgroups to see if what was true across everyone was true for specific groups of people, for instance, based on like geography. Um, and that's a great best practice. Again, they didn't have the variation in the sample to do this for age, obviously for gender. So there are like some limitations here, but like again, a good best practice that was considered. And then they did this whole other like mediating analysis that I'm not going to go into because it doesn't have to do with the findings we're discussing. But it was about like how your views of dogs generally could also impact how you parent dogs. Super interesting if you want to read up on that further. So here is what the researchers learned when they put this all into their model. They learned that for people who were parented permissively, there was what they're calling an intergenerational transmission effect. So, like to put that in simple terms, that means if I was parented permissively, I am more likely to parent my dog permissively. And if you don't recall, permissively is like that, like supportive, more of a free for all, like don't have a tons of rules, but you're really like responsive to needs, right? So if that's what you got growing up, you are more likely to be giving that to your dog. And because they had the interview data, they found that when they interviewed people who use this parenting style, that they actually were like deliberately replicating their experience of receiving that type of like responsive parenting. So that's super interesting to know. Also super interesting and not mentioned in the viral video or the article, which is like travesty, is that if you were parented authoritatively, and remember, authoritatively is kind of like the balance of both. Like there is the structure, but you also have some like more responsiveness to your needs. If you were parented authoritatively, you are also more likely to parent permissively. So this is interesting because it really just highlights how Kinship got it wrong, right? Because if you had permissive parents, you were more likely to be permissive. But if you had authoritative parents, you were also more likely to be permissive. So, do we raise our dogs like our parents raised us? Let's recap. We have a study of WHO 391 predominantly female educated individuals from where? Around the globe. What surveyed and interviewed when in 2023 in order to why learn about how parenting styles may cross generations, and in this case, cross over into how we parent our fur babies. And what the researchers found is that for this specific group of people, if you were parented permissively, you tended to parent your dog permissively. Kinship's headline suggested a much broader claim that we raise our dogs just like our parents raised us. Again, this study really only shows that that is true for permissive parenting. And it even shows that if you were parented authoritatively, you might shift more towards being permissive with your dog. In other words, not every style is carrying over consistently. This nuance here is really important. This viral video, this article, is an example of research being misunderstood. Having read the actual study, I have no idea how Kinship came up with their headline, and it just really underscores why it's important to have this degree of like research and data literacy, particularly if you plan on sharing research with your audience, right? Like you have to read research carefully and check for understanding before you just go putting it out there for people to click and share and, unleash it into the world. What I love about this study, because I don't think this is an example of like bad research at all. What I love about the study, especially if you take the time to like go to the article, is that they share a ton of results, a ton of tables. They seem like they're being very thorough and thoughtful, and it's an interesting study. And like I would say, like, yeah, it's well done, and it's also suffering, again, similar to last week's study, from this lack of diversity, which hinders how broadly this study's findings can be applied. There are lots of opportunities for more research here, including people of different genders, including even more geographic reach, uh, looking at this like more heavily based on how long you've owned a dog or how many dogs you've owned, and like whether that changes parenting. Does having like 5 dogs in your house versus one change how you parent? Like there's just like, it's a really rich opportunity for data here, so like lots of people can build on this work, which I think is really cool. What can we as Is This Legit listeners take away from this? I think the most important takeaway is that you should really carefully read and understand research, or like anything you come across before you share it on the internet, especially if you plan on sharing it in a very like clickbaity way. Kinship is like 1,000% spreading misinformation, and I don't think that's their intention. And it's like cute misinformation, but like it is still misinformation. And this matters. Like mistranslating research into attention grabbing headlines is not just harmless fun. It's something that I take really seriously. Like in this case, do I think that that headline is like hurting people? Probably not. But is it like degrading trust in science because it's not true? Yes. And like that is problematic, in my opinion. This week I picked this study like because it is fun and I do love being a dog mom, but also because it adds this like other layer to finding out if something's legit, which is that it's not enough to know the context. It's also that you need some research literacy to ensure that you are able to represent findings accurately. When studies are taken out of context or when they're oversimplified, we risk spreading misinformation. If we want to create a world where we treat dogs and people better and like live longer, happier, healthier lives, we need to do a better job reading and interpreting data behind the headlines, because otherwise we're making decisions and going about our lives based on bad information, and we don't want to do that. This has been another episode of Is This Legit with me, Dr. Kirsten Lee Hill. Remember, question everything, especially the science that makes it to your screens.